Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's Professor Dave Petley. I'm very fortunate to be Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise here at UEA. And welcome to this inaugural lecture. Inaugural lectures play a really key part in the way that the university functions. I absolutely love chairing them. It's one of the key ways that we share the most exciting research that we do across the institution to a wider audience, and it's great to see you all here tonight. I'm really delighted to welcome those of you who've come from beyond the boundaries of the university, as well as colleagues and students from within the institution, and of course those who are joining us live on the live stream. It's my great honour tonight to introduce the inaugural lecture of Professor Kai-Uwe Kuhn from UEA's School of Economics. He gained his undergraduate degree from the University of Bonn and then went on to study for a Master's in Economics at the London School of Economics, and he did his DPhil at Oxford in 1992. Between 2011 and 2013, he was the Chief Economist to the Directorate General of Competition Policy at the European Commission, leading a team of 25 economists whose remit covered mergers, competition, litigation, state aid, and policy work, all of which feel extremely important issues in the European context. From 1998 to 2015, Kai-Uwe was a tenured associate professor at the University of Michigan. He was also a permanent visiting professor at the Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics and a research fellow at the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London. I'm delighted to say he joined UEA in January 2016 as a professor of economics. He's been the co-editor of the Journal of Industrial Economics. He's published in leading journals such as the Journal of Political Economy, the Rand Journal of Economics, the American Economic Journal, Microeconomics, and the Journal of European Economic Association. His research interests are in theoretical, experimental, and empirical industrial organization, and cover a wide range of topics, including competition in durable goods, vertical integration and vertical restraints, collusion, coordinated effects of mergers, market foreclosure, and the impact of credit constraints on market behavior. In addition to holding senior academic posts and his role as a high-level policy advisor to the European Commission, Kai-Uwe has been a senior consultant at Charles River Associates, a global firm offering economic, financial, and strategic expertise to major law firms, corporations, accounting firms, and governments around the world for the last 3 years. At UEA, we're extremely proud of our cutting-edge research undertaken by colleagues, and further of how this research impacts the world outside of academia. In his role as policy advisor and economic consultant demonstrates, there is a genuine need for academic research to inform and shape our response to a fast-changing world. New technologies and workplace innovations have rewritten our daily lives and are continuing to do so, and probably will do so more in the future. And of course, they are also drastically changing the way that we do business. In tonight's lecture, Kai-Uwe will address some of these disruptive innovations, think everything from Uber to drones to cloud-based data storage, and will outline how policymakers might respond to the ever-changing corporate landscape in which we find ourselves. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Kai-Uwe Kuhn to give his inaugural lecture.
I said I wouldn't have any problems with this mic, and of course I will. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind words. It's a real honor and pleasure to have the opportunity to give this lecture. Let me say a little bit about it, that it's not a review of kind of research that I've done, but it's more a preview and kind of what I hope is a little bit of an intellectual structure for the kind of things that I think is necessary to do in industrial organization research, and in particular also in some of the research that we'll be doing in the Center for Competition Policy here and is really about rethinking how to structure regulatory policy. But in order to do that, I will spend quite a bit of this lecture on thinking about how to think about the challenges that we're facing and what's actually changed and why we might need to react differently to these changes. Okay, so does this work? If it doesn't work, I'm going to go with this. So my overview here should kind of give you something like a didactic introduction on what you're going to learn and where we're going to go, and I'm going to skip all that. In our rapidly changing environment and with a limited duration of this talk, I just don't have the time for that. And if there's a problem with that, we're going to discuss it later. It's kind of the Uber strategy, and I will take that here. Let's start instead by looking at a couple of nice, colorful logos of a lot of the firms. So if you're looking at your right-hand side, you will find kind of all the names that you're very familiar with about Google and Netflix and Facebook and Airbnb and PayPal and everyone else. All of these are relatively young firms, are firms that have grown incredibly fast and have really very much changed the way that business is done in many areas, and they have been made themselves feel as very disruptive in these industries. Think about Apple and the types of phones that we were carrying with us, and the types of companies that have basically gone down. There used to be a telephone maker called Nokia. They mostly sell their patent portfolio these days and do some other technology work, but they're certainly not in the phone production anymore. Okay? So we've had very disruptive innovation from doing very new things, and I've put the left-hand side on here because I think those are the types of companies that help us understand what's new about this. All of these companies that I have on the left-hand side are companies that in one way or another are intermediaries. And really one of the key things about what we're going to call platform companies is that they're intermediaries that go much more directly between the consumer and the primary producer than anything that we've seen before. And these types of internet-based intermediary solutions are in a lot of areas. They're in transport where you know it with Uber, but also with Sidecar and with a lot of others that are actually not even on here that I'm going to talk very briefly about. But it's also with boat exchange, boatbound, and some others. We have kind of in the sharing of living space or working space, not just Airbnb, we have HomeAway and Liquid Space and WeWork and many others that we're not quite as familiar with that are setting up. But long before I ever heard about Uber or I ever heard about Airbnb, there was an entrant before the financial crisis in this space in the financial world, namely Prosper. And I know about this because I had a student who was actually scraping the first rates as Prosper came out, which was this really new thing in which people were saying, I need this much money, and then took bids for people giving credit. So these were kind of some of the first crowdfunding solutions that were organized as something that in economics we often call two-sided markets, but as a platform where small lenders and small borrowers were actually brought together in transactions that you would probably never see in any bank. Prosper is still around, although a lot of banks haven't been prospering in the last couple of years. And I certainly know because we did a lot of restructuring and even bank closing work when I was still at the commission. Okay? So we got this in a lot of areas. We got it in personal services, professional services. We've even got it in consumer goods. And I want to talk a little bit about how that change to intermediary solutions actually has disrupted businesses and regulation quite generally in the economy. But there are also, in the wake of this, calls to change regulation. And there are some very, very large voices, especially in governments and in the press, that are telling us that's really time to do something. There's an example here that I have from The Guardian where the headline is, "Can anything curb the dominance of the internet's big guns? E-commerce has been built to favor the tech giants. Only new regulations that recognize the plight of spunky startups and SMEs can help weaken their grip." So there's a real concern that the big guys are taking over. I'll show you that there might also be a different view here that basically says, actually what these companies have done is open up the doors for SMEs and small companies, but the structure is one that, in a traditional way of thinking about large firms, does not fit our intuitions about the problems that we might actually have with large firms. And I don't want to say with that, and I will never say kind of in this talk, that there's no need for regulation, but there is an issue about what type of regulation is needed and identifying the issues that actually need to be addressed. One of the biggest problems that we have at the moment, and I think that's why research, especially in this area, is so urgent as well, is that when I talk to regulators in the UK, in Brussels, in Germany, again and again, one gets the clear reactions that there are these big guys out there, and there's clearly a problem, and something needs to be done about it. But if you're talking to them what exactly the problem is, things are getting vague. But we know that we should be regulating the Googles and the Amazons and so on and so forth. That's not a very satisfactory state of things, and I want to give you a little bit of a framework why we might actually be there. Because at the moment, there are numerous regulatory interventions that use some instruments of regulation that might even be surprising that they're being used. For example, we have competition cases, one big competition case in Germany at the moment against Facebook, where Facebook is accused of abusing a dominant position by asking for too much data. Okay? There's a big question, a big debate out there whether that's a genuine competition policy case and whether actually the usage of data that Facebook has is anything more than any other company without market power would also be doing in that space, and whether that's just a question of privacy protection and whether that should be dealt with very different instruments. So there's a question also of the instruments of regulation that we should be using. There are lots of others. There's what I now call Google 1 through N. I was originally at the commission when the Google case started. I'm by now don't quite understand anymore what the Google case is actually about, but it is an example of the many facets that are there. eBooks was an interesting case in this context. I don't know whether anyone has heard about these cases. The eBooks case was a case where the publishers came together and said, we don't like Amazon setting such low prices. We need to get control over their prices, and they figured out a scheme with Apple that allowed them to commit that they would only contract with Amazon by changing the contract scheme by which they could set the prices and therefore raise the prices. This was dealt with as a collusive scheme. Apple and these firms lost in the US in court. There were commitment decisions done in Europe. And one of the reasons why the firms were doing this, why the publishers were very reluctant to have low prices on ebooks, which are actually much, much cheaper to produce, was that they didn't want the markets to slip to ebooks so quickly. And why was this? Well, it was precisely the intermediation issue that they were worried about. Because intermediation in many cases of these firms doesn't mean that there's someone who comes in between the buyer and the seller. It means there's someone coming in between, taking out a lot of other intermediaries that were making the money before. And what the publishers were really worried about is that the authors would directly go to Amazon, and Amazon just would put their manuscript for download. Actually, exactly that has happened. If you're looking at Amazon Unlimited, there are lots and lots of authors who are publishing, self-publishing, putting it onto Amazon Unlimited, and when these books get successful, they actually go on and go with publishers and have bigger distribution lines. So again, new business models here, new possibilities also for authors to come up, and again, this theme of intermediation. The issue here is big. The European Commission has just come out with a large inquiry on e-commerce. The CMA is preparing a large study of price comparison or general comparison sites. So there's the sense there is a problem. What needs to be fixed? Where do markets not work? At the same time, it's actually quite interesting that some of the big internet companies are telling us that there are problems of overregulation in this industry. I've put up one of the examples that says the following: current regulations on financial technology are a significant market barrier for would-be financial technology disruptors and sometimes serve to protect incumbent providers from new competition. According to a white paper released in July by the Financial Innovation Now, it's a consortium of Amazon, Apple, Google, Intuit, and PayPal. Okay? Here are some of these disruptors that are doing their own commerce, and it's also one characteristic of the things that they're doing is that they're going into neighboring areas in which they're also getting active. Okay? One of the really active and important business lines that Google or now Alphabet have is actually their venture capital business, in which they are actually financing a lot of important startups in Silicon Valley, including Uber. And they're also now making competition to Uber with their own plans, especially with their self-driving cars. So it's a complex web of things here where we're seeing that something really, really fast happens. So what is so disruptive about disruptive innovation? Well, the difference here in innovation, and that makes it disruptive both to other competitors and to regulators, is that we have product innovation here that goes hand in hand with the innovation in business models. We have a rapid change in business models and rapid experimentation with business models. In fact, the business models that some of these firms that I'm talking about are using is actually changing very, very quickly. I'm going to give you an example later on of TripAdvisor that changed its business model completely through several steps within 2 years. Okay? So there's a very, very quick adaptation and change to the things that they're doing and the expansion of their activities. What it challenges is the traditional structures that we had in many industries about how vertical integration and disintegration works in an economy. Which kind of activities are within the firms and which activities are outside of the firms, which were structures that have been very, very stable over many years, but are now being questioned. And they're even questioned in much more traditional industries like cars, where the model of the manufacturer selling through a retailer to the final customer is being questioned. And for example, Tesla is doing direct marketing to end consumers. And this is actually something all of the major high-quality car producers are thinking about. And one of the reasons why they haven't been doing it, for example, in Europe, which I know from talking to some of them, is because they're really worried about the regulatory framework and that they might get into trouble. Okay? Disintermediation, I told you about the ebooks case. The second thing that is so important, I think, about these new firms is that they're creating institutional structures through their intermediation framework to which they can link on lots of things that are open to rapid change in the market and innovations that others build onto them. So what they're trying to create is kind of an ecosystem where they're at the center and they can do new things and others can do new things on top of it. And if you're thinking about Uber, you wouldn't be able to think about it without the apps that are available on iTunes or on the Android operating system. Okay? So one of the things that is happening here is that an age-old question in economics is asked again more forcefully: what are the boundaries of the firm? Why do firms actually exist? Why don't we do everything through markets? Why do we have some things within the firm and some things outside of the firm? And what is happening here is that we had kind of theories that go back about transaction costs that try to explain why sometimes things within the firm are easier to do than outside the firm, and the relative transaction costs of these activities are actually changing dramatically. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how old firms have a certain way of being locked into what they've been doing, and therefore they're very exposed to what these new firms are doing that have been starting up fresh and are not locked into their previous situations. One of the things why this is so unusually broad is also that the vertical disintegration pushes go into areas that we've never seen before. For example, everything that's transport, like Uber, or even delivery services, like Hermes. We have disintegration between the firm as the platform and the workers who are becoming self-employed. And one of the questions is, why is this happening? And it's also something that's challenging the regulatory structure, because people say, well, isn't this really a labor relationship or not? And we need to understand why this is happening in order to find the right regulatory framework. So let me give this all a little bit of a framework. One thing that I find useful about how to think about firms and changes in firms is to think about two things that are really important to do. One is the coordination of complementary activity, and the second one is innovation. Okay? And in the current environment, there is a certain conflict there between coordination and innovation, and this is going to determine the optimal choice of organizational form. We had very little of a conflict between coordination and new information technologies when we started with information technology. If you remember, like 20 years ago, when everybody was talking about just-in-time production, all that information technology was doing was help coordinate supply relationships and supply chains in a much better way, to the extent that if anybody kind of fell, you had supply disruptions in the car industry because you didn't have any stocks anymore. But what it was doing, it was using information technology to improve the coordination of different activities of supply and production in a way that went much more smoothly at much lower cost. Okay? So the conflict between innovation and coordination, you see for the first time when you're looking at the competition that Apple and the Windows operating system had in the PC world, in the old PC world. There, Apple was competing with this beautiful closed system where everything was working nicely all together, but no one could really write software really well for them because they wanted to keep their very closed system. Okay? One of the reasons why Windows, when it came up and basically imitated Apple with a graphical interface, was so successful is that they kept the Windows system open so that application software could be written to this operating system. And the application software multiplied, and people went to the PC, although a lot of people said Apple was more powerful and better, but they went to the PC because the application software was basically there and it was more available. And Apple went dramatically down until they had the revival when Steve Jobs came back. Apple really learned from that. And so let me say about what that actually means. So Apple went for the perfect coordination for their devices. The device and the software were completely integrated. They had complete control over it, and it worked together really well. What they didn't allow is to have ideas from outside improve the whole overall system and the value of it. That Windows allowed to do, and so the Windows operating system became very valuable as a platform because everybody was writing software to it. Apple learned from that. They kept a lot of the things that were their best feature, which is they have this very integrated hardware and software that actually made your screen work much better than the early screens on Android devices. right? Because it was built together. But what they learned from Windows was that they needed to have a platform that was open enough that lots of people would write applications for it, because they wouldn't be able to, within Apple, have all of the ideas for all of the apps that you're now going to find on the iTunes store. So what this industry has learned is to have a balance between closedness of coordination of the core system and then buying in innovations from others that makes the system overall more valuable. Similar problems you're going to see for Google with its Android operating system. Google had the problem that if Apple was the dominant smartphone, they were losing out with access for their search on some of the main smartphones around. So what they needed was an alternative operating system that was not Apple controlled, on which they could distribute their search windows, essentially. And so they created Android, but their problem with Android was that it was an open system, right? So everybody could attach something on it. And their biggest problem was, if you then fragment this, the whole benefit of having a uniform Android on which you can distribute collapses. So there was this key balance to keep in keeping it as a single Android system, but still allowing other people to build on it. And that's been a conflict for Google ever since. And the newest news are that Google has come out now truly with its own phone. And there's a question whether they're going to close their system in a similar way to Apple. Okay? So the theme here is coordination to have everything work together really well, but that reduces the ability to innovate and adapt. Okay, so good coordination of complementary activities increases efficiency, but the better coordinated, the harder change is. And kind of one of the pictures that I would like you to have in your mind, and there I might have been affected from having been in the US too long and having read everything about the culture wars there, but there was this big debate in the US that evolution couldn't actually be true because it was far too complex, right? There were all these complementary things in these beautiful organisms that could only work together if they worked together in that way. And if you change anything, it would all collapse. Well, you have something very similar here with these types, with firms. That is, there's so many complementary elements to how they are functioning. You know, you're locked into something, and if you're changing something, you're going to need to change a lot of things, right? So much of the conflict that we see today are between disruptive business models and models that are well calibrated to the pre-internet environment. And so one of the things that one always has to be careful about on all of these discussions is that there may be some real problems that need to be addressed in a regulatory way. And there are a lot of losers in this system that have a very hard time to change. These are the newspapers, these are the telecom companies, these are some of the other companies, these are the car companies that have a very hard time integrating the software that they need, for example, for self-driving cars into the really good engineering that they have for the cars. Right? So you might say, well, why is coordination actually so difficult? And I want to take you in just a little detour into some of the experimental work on it that tells you about it. And I just kind of want to take this to give a little bit of intuition, because I think in economics for a long time we thought if there are coordination problems, people kind of can resolve them pretty easily. And I think a very different view is important here. Coordination problems mean you need management. You need people who actually actively coordinate so that two people who are doing something are going to be ready at the same time so that you have the end product. Okay? That's really what management is all about. Let me just tell you a little bit about kind of one of the first experimental results where people kind of realize that coordination failure can be a really severe problem. This is from I forgot to have the reference here. This is Batalio, Hoek, and is it just the two? You will know. Sorry? Yeah, Vale, yes. And just look at the upper panel. it's basically telling you what your choices are. 7 is the highest, the best, and 1 is the lowest, given what kind of the lowest choice of others are. And if the choice of the other is 7, then your best response is 7, right? Because you get 130 instead of if you're choosing, if the smallest value is, wait a second, why is this your choice? If you, this is the problem. If you're standing right in front of this and you don't see it anymore. No, I don't understand this. Blanking out. The best response to everything is itself. Yes, no, that's right. But if someone else has 6, if you're then doing the highest, that's a bad idea, and you might want to do something lower. The problem in these, the point is if you're looking kind of at equilibrium and what the best thing to do is, if everybody would be doing 7, if everybody would be doing the best, and that's the intuition of this, if everybody would be doing the best, then for you it's also good to do the best. So if you're basically saying, look, if we keep the deadline tomorrow, we're going to look really, really good. But it's a Sunday, so you have to forget about the family, and then we're going to get ready, and it's going to be really good. And it's really worthwhile to do that if the other person who's writing the paper with you is going to do that as well. But if you can't rely on that, it might actually be more worthwhile to do things with your family, because if you're doing the work and it's not finished tomorrow anyway, you're not going to get the big prize that makes it worthwhile not to work with the family. So if you have to rely on others cooperating, then you actually might not end up in the good cooperating outcome. And in this kind of context, you might end up in something that's really, really bad because everybody is worried about the risk of the other one not complying, not because they wouldn't want to, and if they could talk about it and organize themselves would, but it's hard to do without actually coming to a common understanding. There's some really interesting experimental work on this that basically shows what you need to get out of these situations is someone who tells you what to do. It's not even incentives. It's just someone who tells you what to do, a manager. And so management is all about coordinating activities. And all I wanted to say is that this coordination isn't easy, and you need management activity to do it, and that's the essence of management. So the second thing that I wanted to emphasize is when organizations have to adjust to changes in the environment, typically they have to change a lot. They have to change almost everything because these things are chosen in a way that they fit together. There's a very interesting quote from Milgram, Kian, and Roberts on complementarity's momentums and the evolution of modern manufacturers, where they go back to Chandler's description of the Industrial Revolution, where Chandler's account of 19th century American economic growth, for example, the emergence of large industrial enterprise was accompanied not only by improvements in communication and transportation that helped to create national markets, so made the market bigger so that you could achieve scale, but also innovations in finance that were necessary in order to make the investments that were necessary, management methods like cost accounting, large-scale manufacturing technologies, and so on. So basically, a change that comes from technologies of integrating markets, kind of in order to be fully exploited, means to change a whole number of complementary things. So one of the questions then is, can a manager even think through all of the adaptations that are necessary? Do people actually sit down, even if they're in management, and basically say, oh, the internet is now here. This is the new business model. That's the right model. I think no one thinks that they can think through in this way. So while our rational models actually work well for day-to-day managerial decisions that are done repeatedly on prices, something when we're getting in a rapidly changing environment where you have to make large-scale decisions in multiple dimensions, doesn't necessarily work so good in every circumstances. So what I want to emphasize here, and this is something that's little emphasized, but I think is crucial for thinking about the changes to the regulatory environment, is to think about the market, not just kind of the place in which prices are set and people are competing in prices and offers, but think about the markets as a social learning mechanism of people who are trying out things, not because they've thought through everything, but because they thought they've got the great solution. And a lot of people who think they've got a great solution don't have a great solution and don't succeed. And some people who found a great solution probably for very bad reasons, but they succeed. But the interesting thing is that markets are not just because of the price-setting mechanism very effective. They're very effective ways of allowing for experimentation and weeding out bad ideas, right? So basically what happens in markets is that someone has an idea, enters the market. If it's a good idea, they actually grow, and others who had worse idea exit. Or they have an idea, it's a bad idea, and they exit relatively quickly. And actually what we're seeing is that in a lot of countries in which that mechanism functions well, the growth performance and the efficiency performance is relatively high. And in countries like Greece, or for example, Portugal, in which that kind of mechanism isn't working so well, we actually see a lot of inefficiencies in firm persisting, specifically in those firms and in those areas in which that selection function of the market isn't working. The other aspect about that is so important and crucial is that we know that this mechanism is one of the biggest contributors to welfare in terms of growth that we have in the economy, and in that sense much bigger than anything that we can think of in terms of the losses or gains from the gains from eliminating market power. For example, there are a number of studies, and I've only put two in here, that have shown how large the impact on productivity growth is from selection of more efficient firms and the elimination from less efficient firms from the markets. So a UK study found about 50% productivity growth at establishment level and about 80 to 90% of total factor productivity growth from that mechanism. Similarly, we know kind of in retailing from another study that virtually all of the efficiency gains come from establishments closing and new establishments opening that are more efficient. So even if economic agents are boundedly rational but are trying to make some profit and react according to that, the market actually is pretty good at selecting good solutions if you let it do that, okay? So good outcomes don't necessarily have to rely on people being hyper-rational, but they very strongly rely on the good and efficient being surviving and the bad and the inefficient not surviving. Now, one of the things that we have in our context is one additional element when we're coming back to these platform markets, namely that a lot of these platforms have built adaptability into their models. They're actually trying to think a little bit ahead and actually mimic some of these market situations themselves. For example, one of the ways in which Amazon is a very disruptive company is that internally they're creating these little companies and startups. And the ones that survive, they make big, and the ones that don't work, they shut down really quickly. This allows them to adapt to the market in a very rapid pace. So if we're looking at these platform markets, we should keep in mind a couple of elements that are crucial. One is they're intermediaries for multiple clients. Their modularity in activities that allows them to mix and match a lot of things. And a growth model that builds on extending activities into new markets and building on a given consumer base. Okay, so I think I need to dramatically speed up, but I'm already coming to the regulatory challenge, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and I'm going to give you one example of differences in regulatory systems in their ability to cope with innovations. So on the regulatory side, we kind of see concerns about some of these firms becoming very large and fairly dominant. And an argument that I always hear again is, remember Microsoft for 5 years, they didn't do anything with their web browser. That's the danger to innovation that we have. But if you're looking at Google that has 95% of the search in Europe, you can't see them slowing down in kind of the innovation that they're doing. So what's going on there? How do we know whether contractual provisions are anti-competitive, efficiency enhancing, or simply transitory instruments that will yield to something better as the firms learn? That's really hard to find out as a regulator. Do we need to protect consumers because they're systematically fooled? It's an issue in the Google case. I can tell you that a lot of the consumers are very sophisticated because even if they're fooled into choosing something they didn't want, they look at it and say, oh, we don't want them, let me search again. And that's actually how Google has a good search outcome. Okay? So these questions are actually difficult to answer and don't have obvious answers. Is the vertical disintegration effectively eroding necessary worker protection? Or is it doing what Uber says, is we're actually allowing people to have a side job that always wanted one and give them full flexibility of their work time? Right? Can we have both of these worlds or not? These are hard questions for regulation because we kind of have to look ahead and see what does this mean for people's work lives in the future. Do we need to act before it's too late? Or are we locking in certain industry structures by acting too early and therefore not allowing the innovation to play out? What are the costs of regulatory intervention? And I think this is one of the big research questions to think about what the costs could actually be and specifying that. The second thing where regulation has real difficulties is that typically all regulation is backward-looking. If you're looking both in terms of regulation and in terms of competition policy through precedent. So for example, there's a discussion now on selective distribution of the internet. Everybody discusses it in terms of luxury goods. Well, we have new problems on the internet that have led to more and more selective distribution in this area, and they have to do with fulfillment when you've ordered on the internet. If you're in the shop, you're taking it home. If you're on the internet, you worry, am I going to get it? That's actually what Amazon's main business is. It's not selling stuff, it's delivering it. Okay? Other things, if you can compare prices, that's great. But if I'm a brand manufacturer, I actually have different products at different price points, and I might want you to compare those instead of just looking for the lowest price. Should I be allowed to do that? Well, maybe that's a good thing for a consumer to kind of see what that quality price trade-off is, right? Actually, here in the UK, when we were talking with regulators, they were worried that pure price comparison sites might be suppressing the comparison in other dimensions of self-quality. And it was an issue that they found important. Secondly, if you're looking at regulation, it's typically tied to business formats. That's franchise regulation. There are certain things that you can do if you have certain business structures. What current innovation is doing, namely business format and innovation, is breaking that up. Basically, it falls outside the regulatory structure because it's not geared towards the regulatory framework. So could we have regulation that isn't bound to business format? And the last thing is really, we also have to think about regulators being boundedly rational. Can they really outguess the market? And what does that mean for intervention? Where's the self-correcting mechanism for regulators that we do have through the market? Can we build that into regulation? Some kind of self-correction. Okay. How much time do I have left? I don't think very much. No. Let me give you the Uber story, then I'm going to give you the story about regulation, how you can make it kind of one way of kind of giving more room to innovation from the regulatory side, and then wrap up with what I think is the research issue. Let me give you one example of the Uber story, and they're an example of do drivers get a bad deal. Uber is disruptive in a number of ways. It disrupts well-protected taxi markets. It challenges regulations on return to base for private hire, entry regulation into taxi markets, license requirements for transport, etc. All things that good competition regulators actually like about them. But there are also other things where they're worried. If you're getting into a car, you have a consumer, have you ever thought about whether they're actually insured, or are you assuming that any taxi is insured and therefore Uber too? That's a consumer protection issue of asymmetric information. Is the car maintained? Well, there's regulation on that if you're a licensed taxi driver, not necessarily if you were Uber Pop. Okay. What about surge pricing? Does that exploit consumers, or does it give good incentives to increase supply when needed? But one of the areas, which is kind of like consumer protection just on the labor side, is what about drivers? Do they get exploited? There are a lot of headlines that says they do. So Uber faces court battles with drivers over employment status. They settled that in California, actually in a very innovative way, that they still don't have employment status, but they have created rules that work for Uber. Okay. Life as a Hermes driver, they offload all risk on the courier, one man's experience of the exhausting and poorly paid work on offer at the online delivery group. All of this from this fall. The questions we have to ask is, why would bad working conditions and low pay not be remedied by competition? Why not go to a better job? At least one wants to identify the problem to find a remedy. Now, I can construct a good economic theory why this might be the case. So this might have something to do with asymmetric information, a little bit of bounded rationality, and then being trapped because you don't have enough money. Here comes the story. You're being told you can deliver 70 parcels a day, and you get £3 a parcel you deliver. And you calculate it up and say, I can live on that. Right? What you're not counting on, and what no one told you is, well, since you're using your own car, you have costs of the cars, the brakes actually go really fast. And there are kind of all of these other costs. And once you're doing it, you actually find, A, that it costs you a lot more, and B, that you're actually spending a lot more time on it than just the delivery time because you're waiting for hours for the packages and so on and so forth. So suddenly this job isn't as good anymore as you thought, but your pay is so low that you can't afford not to work to go around and look for work, and so you feel trapped. Right? So here I have a story that says worker protection might really be needed. Right? Again, though, sometimes markets surprise us, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have regulation, but markets surprise us. We just recently had entry in New York of a company that builds on the fact that they need to build a driver pool in order to be a good competitor, and they did that by going to Uber drivers and telling them, tell us all the things you don't like about Uber as a driver. We're going to improve it. And they basically put aside 50% of the income in order to give shares to Uber drivers and therefore secure them economically more strongly, together with a couple of other features that they put in. So again here, they're very innovative solutions that firms are finding in the market. And one of the questions is, should we go on with traditional regulation, or can we find ways of unlocking the innovativeness of firms in our regulatory framework? Let me give you one example where I think the US has an advantage on us. This example is something where there was a big discussion about in the area of patents and standard essential patents, namely the preference of injunctions as remedies in the European legal system relative to damages and settlements in the US system. Okay? So what happens with Uber? Uber is basically in Germany now, has been reduced to a slight presence in 2 cities, Munich and Berlin. Everywhere else they were shut down, basically, and their attempts of resurging as a taxi companies hasn't worked because they couldn't get enough drivers who had spent the 3 months of learning for the license. Okay? Now, this has happened over and over again. It's happening in Spain. It's happening in a lot of other countries, that they're basically pushed out of a market because their business model does not fit the regulatory framework. It's not as if that wasn't a problem in the US either. Uber also violated local regulatory frameworks, and it was sued for it. And what happened, for example, with them suing with labor, or Airbnb being sued by some people, was that the judges would tell them, well, go away and find a way to work it out. And in all of these cases, the firms, together with the complainant, have found new institutional structures that would deal with these issues. So one of the questions is whether the way our legal system works hampers innovation relative to what we're seeing in the US, and whether that kind of adaptability is better. Theoretically, the idea there is that you're basically saying with our regulatory framework, we're creating a benchmark of a minimum that someone will get. And if there's a possibility to negotiate away from that so that everybody's better off, we allow them to do that through the legal system instead of shutting them down. Okay? This is just one way of starting to think the design of adaptive regulation. How can we make regulation that is not just based on the status quo that we know, but that allows to adaptively work even with changing institutions that we have? Can we design regulation that targets the underlying problem? For example, what are the real underlying problems that we're trying to protect through worker protection? Where could we be more flexible? Where can we put in minima from which you can negotiate away? How do we distinguish between people who are threatened and people who actually have a preference for part-time employment and flexibility at the workplace? Okay? So there are different goals that we have here, and there are a lot of areas in which we should be rethinking about what we're trying to achieve with the regulation and how in this environment we can optimize this. This is a much broader agenda than we used to have when we were thinking about utility regulation. When we were thinking about utility regulation, the main issue was how do we get prices down close to cost and don't take away the incentives to reduce costs. This is much more complex. It affects the whole production chain, and it affects the question of how do we actually stimulate innovation while still achieving the regulatory goals. I think that's a large research agenda that actually the changes that we're seeing from disruptive innovation is setting, but it's something that's really urgent to think about because we're getting in a situation in which regulations are changing, are adapting, are to some extent very intrusive, and we're getting very different innovative outcomes in different countries that have chosen different paths. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. I'm Daphne Collier. I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to thank you for that fascinating talk. I don't think I'm ever going to look at regulatory policy in the same way again. And I think it's absolutely fascinating to think about the fact that starting by looking at what it is it's trying to address is at the heart of it rather than the process. And I think it's an exceptionally interesting discussion point about how you for me, enlightened me about that relationship between innovation and coordination, which is something that I'd never really considered, but it's absolutely fascinating to me as a social scientist. So we have time for a few questions. Are you happy to take questions?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so we have a microphone, and I'd ask that people will wait for the microphone to come through so that we can be sure our online audience can hear the question. So do we have a question in the audience, please? I'm just going to move out the bright light. I'm afraid it's a bit glare.
Yep. I too found it fascinating. The thing I wanted to pick up on is that the alternative regulation, what you characterised as the American solution, go away and sort it out together.
Yeah.
Now, that sounds a nice idea, but it's reminiscent of not quite the same policies, but sort of pay for delay for pharmaceutical companies negotiating a deal with the generics to come in more slowly. It's reminiscent of possibilities for you to be coming to a cooperative solution with a potential competitor. I know you're not worried by these sorts of solutions as opposed to a more traditional form of regulation.
Okay, so I think the analogy is exactly false in this case. Okay, so the pay and even more so since I've helped enforced against pay for delay. No, pay for delay is a situation where you have a competitor coming in and you just basically pay them off to stay out of the market. That is essentially the essence of it. Here, if you're looking at these conflicts, it's, for example, litigation between the drivers and the platform, where the platform says, well, in the current situation, we want you to take all the risks. They say, no, we have rights as workers because this is effectively like a working relationship. They have a good chance of actually winning that in court, even in the US. So now you have kind of an outside option, which is a regulatory structure for working relationships. And now these are complements. So these are guys who should be cooperating. And now all that you're doing is, through the regulation, actually putting a lower bound on what you need to give to the worker. And then the question is, in the negotiation, can you come up with something that increases the pie relative to the standard labor contract? Okay? So this is not a collusive outcome when it's kind of between people who have complementary, we're talking about complements here. Okay? Other situations, like with Airbnb, is people who are worried about the externalities that come from the activity, kind of suing them on this, may have something to do with zoning and so on and so forth. So one of the issues, for example, in Airbnb in a lot of communities is that they're worried either about the housing prices generally going up or about the renting through Airbnb not kind of contribute to the general benefit of the population. And so Airbnb had a couple of court cases on that, and part of the things that they did in order to settle was actually create some programs where the community could benefit through kind of cleaning services for the apartments and so on and so forth. So they became very creative in trying to buy off the community in order to be more satisfied about that when it's an externality question. So these are not people that are in competition with them directly. This is not them making a deal with the hotels, right? That's not what we're talking about.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so in the center.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. This is very new to me, and maybe my question will be irrelevant, but I'd like to ask questions about agile. I don't know if you have heard about. This is a concept, a way of thinking that is designed to to adapt to changes.
Uh-huh.
And if you have heard about, I would like to know if it can be used and how it can be used to design adaptive regulation. Thank you.
Okay. So I haven't heard about it. So then I can't really answer your question in that sense. But I do think, I mean, one of the things that I think is very important in changing environments and also when we're changing structures, and I think one of the things that we're seeing in terms of reactions to globalization is that we have to think more about the redistributional effects that we're having. So the people who are negatively affected, in order not to get backlashes against liberalizing reforms. And so I do think kind of the issue of how do you adapt to changes and empowering people to adapt to changes is something that's of some importance.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much, Professor, and it's great to have you at UEA.
Thank you.